Welcome, good evening. This is Inside Without Now, a live and podcast brought to you by volunteers with refusefascism.org. I'm Sam, one of those volunteers. Refuse Fascism is a movement of people coming from diverse perspectives, united in the recognition that the Trump-Pence regime poses a catastrophic danger to all of humanity and the planet itself, and it must be driven from power through sustained mass nonviolent protests. Tonight, we will be joined by author and journalist Sarah Posner to discuss her new book, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. We are counting on you to take a moment and share this right now, especially if you're viewing on Facebook, to be hosting watch parties and groups that you're a part of. We want to hear from you. Make sure to let us know what city you're joining us from or town you're joining us from. And let us know what you're thinking about right now, especially questions that you have for Sarah. We'll be drawing from those questions during tonight's live. For podcast enthusiasts, Inside Without Now is available on just about all your favorite listening platforms, so be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. Before I bring on Sarah, I want to talk about Portland, because it's not just Portland. In an ominous escalation of fascism, the Trump-Pence regime sent federal agents from multiple agencies to storm the streets of Portland, Oregon, and crush protests. Dressed in camouflage with no identifying insignia, these agents rolled up in unmarked vans, arrested people without telling them where they were going or why they were being taken into custody, deployed tear gas, and shot at least one nonviolent protester in the face. Attorney Juan Chavez of the Oregon Justice Resource Center said, "It's like stop and frisk meets Guantanamo Bay. You have laws regarding probable cause that can lead to arrest," he said. "It sounds more like an abduction. It sounds like they're kidnapping people off the street." And despite what many will tell you, this is not political theater. It is a dangerous advance from a regime that has declared their determination to crush the opposition and hammer in their rule by terror and brute force. It is a regime that was not doing political theater when they caged immigrant children, when they banned Muslims, or when they dropped the mother of all bombs. America is at a serious crossroads. A fierce struggle for the future is underway. Camouflage soldiers that look virtually indistinguishable from right-wing militias, free to kidnap and detain anyone at their will, is a horror that must be stopped now. You have fascist Trump today reaffirming his pledge to send his stormtroopers into big cities, democratic cities, to sweep up protesters, and let's get real, to sweep up our Black brothers and sisters. This is the time to draw the line, and definitely a time where, if you haven't already, it's time to be taking a stand with humanity. Fascism has direction and momentum. Dissent is piece by piece criminalized. The truth is bludgeoned. Group after group is demonized and targeted along a trajectory that leads to only greater horror. All of this has taken dramatic leaps under the Trump-Pence regime. History has shown us that fascism must be stopped before it becomes too late. If we lose the right to protest by legal or extra-legal means, all bets are off. Trump is not losing an election. He is setting the stage to declare any outcome other than his victory illegitimate. And this we heard on the Chris Wallace interview the other day. Backed up by the GOP willing to rig elections and the violence of the police, military, and bikers for Trump to attack and suppress any opposition to their program. There is now a rapid deployment force at the command of the federal government that can be sent with a mission to suppress protests, but also anything else. And let's consider who's deploying and commanding these rapid deployment force. This orange Cheeto lunatic with his finger on the nuclear button. This fascist in chief. And this is all heading into an election. Waiting for November to remove Trump is like waiting for rain when a house is on fire. Today, Trump said they grab a lot of people in jail, they're leaders, they're anarchists, they hate our country, talking about what was going down in Portland. He's talking about kidnapping their leaders because of their politics. There's no even pretending that this is about criminal activity, just thought crimes. This is open fascism. President Trump said today that he plans to send more federal law enforcement to New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, Baltimore, Oakland, and other cities to deal with unrest. Homeland Security, as reported by the Chicago Tribune, is making plans to deploy some 150 agents to Chicago. But there's hope. Dangerous regimes all over the world have been driven out by the people in sustained nonviolent protests, demanding the removal of the regime and refusing to go home until their demand is met. To stop an American fascism that threatens the very future of humanity and the planet, the necessary demand is Trump Pence Out Now. So we wanted to salute everyone in Portland who's been coming out in growing numbers, responding to the repression with greater protests, including the Wall of Moms. We want to shout out the ACLU of Oregon, who has filed court actions against the Trump-Pence regime's deployment and their blatant violation of the rights of people to protest. We want to shout out Refuse Fascism New York City, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, who took to the streets on Saturday to protest the federal crackdown on Portland, saying no more police murder of Black people, no fascist police state, no fascist military war on the people, no federal agents sweeping up protesters, Trump Pence Out Now. Cheers to everyone who joined in, and shout out to those in Chicago who are in the streets tonight. Cheers as well to Refuse Fascism Detroit and Honolulu, who also took the streets today. And you can join Philadelphia on Tuesday in protest and Cleveland on Wednesday. You can find information at refusefascism.org. To support these lives, the podcast, their promotion, and most importantly, mobilizing to people to get in the streets to end this nightmare before it becomes too late, we hope that by the end of tonight, you'll chip in and donate to support this. All donations up to $1,000 will be matched if made tonight. In the comments, someone will be posting a link. Understanding where we are and how we got here is critical to getting ourselves out of this mess. Tonight, we are discussing Unholy, why white evangelicals worship at the altar of Donald Trump, with journalist and author Sarah Posner. Sarah is a journalist who writes about the intersection of religion and politics and has covered the Christian right for roughly 15 years. She is currently a reporting fellow with Type Investigations. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for having me.
So glad to have you with us. I want to start with the big question, the question that your book centers around. Can you explain to us why true believers, which, you write, they are true believers, could possibly believe that God of all people would choose Donald Trump?
Well, for Trump's white evangelical base, Christianity is a very politicized. It's a very politicized version of Christianity. So they believe that America was founded as a Christian nation, and Christian nation is defined very narrowly from their perspective of what Christianity is. And so their politicization in the second half of the 20th century was very centered on being a backlash to changes that happened in the American legal system, in American politics, and American culture. So it was a backlash against Brown v. Board of Education and school desegregation. It was a backlash against Supreme Court decisions upholding church-state separation and banning mandatory public school Bible reading and prayer. It was a backlash against other elements of the civil rights movement. It was a backlash against women's rights and LGBTQ rights. So to them, Trump has come along and expressed their grievances in a very potent way for them. And he has made them feel like he is going to give them the power to seize back the power that they feel like they lost. And so he speaks to these grievances kind of perfectly, even though you could not argue, and many of them don't even argue, that he is a believing Christian or even can cite anything from the Bible to support his political positions. It's really more about power, and it's about his ability to articulate their grievances and give them the tools of governing either through political appointees at agencies or judicial nominees to reverse these trends that they feel like eroded and, in their view, attacked their cultural position.
Thank you for that. I think that, one of the questions that I wondered while I was reading your book was, and I've been wondering for some time, as many others, that why has Trump been able to advance Christian fascism in a way that, let's say, Bush or Reagan could only dream of?
So Trump it's a few things. One of it just sort of his sort of more bombastic personality, which you could see as being unchristian, that he readily insults people. He uses foul and cruel language. But for his base, that can be seen as he's telling it like it is. He's unafraid to take on political correctness, or he's unafraid to take on the left, which is out to destroy our religious freedom, which is another way that they frame civil rights for other people they frame it as an attack on their religious freedom. So unlike, say, Reagan or either of the Bushes, Trump is not concerned about his political legacy or even making any kind of gestures towards bipartisanship and compromise. Reagan and both Bushes wanted to at least give an appearance of bipartisanship. They were concerned about how they would be viewed in history. They were much more conventional Republicans than Trump is. Trump isn't really, conventional in that sense at all. But in a lot of ways, he personifies the sort of leader that the American right has been looking for, which is somebody who would sort of dispense with these, what they would consider niceties of liberal democracy, and be much more of a strong man to achieve their goals.
And do you think that those elements, the freedom that he has, or he feels he has, to throw away those niceties or the things that makes, democratic rights, norms, those types of things, that so many things foundational, his ability to feel unburdened by those and to unburden others, is that part of why he's able to unite people that seem so different? I mean, DeVos isn't the same as a Pompeo in terms of their understanding of religion, or Barr isn't the same as a Pence. Like they're different but is it that they have that same underlining agenda?
Well, I think that I would sort of phrase it differently. I do think that Barr and Pence and Pompeo and DeVos all come out of the same kind of religious political movement, where they believe that it's okay for this very conservative, even like radical right version of Christianity to be the lodestar for governing and the law. I think that the coalition that Trump put together, maybe in some instances not like deliberately, like these people weren't in a room together, but if you look at, say, Stephen Miller and Betsy DeVos or Mike Pompeo, they weren't necessarily coming from the same milieu. I would put Stephen Miller much more coming from the nativist white nationalist right. But these two movements, the Christian right and the alt-right, came together in support of Trump because even though they articulate their goals in different ways and have different priorities, the Christian right's stated priorities are more centered on religious liberty and church-state separation and abortion and LGBTQ rights. And the alt-right is more centered on white nationalism and white supremacy. But they both found kind of common cause in Trump precisely because he is willing to dispense with the norms of a liberal democracy, separation of powers, an independent judiciary, a free press, and so on, civil and human rights for everyone, including out groups, and those both groups found common cause in that approach that Trump has, that strongman approach. So a through line of my book is, even though they weren't necessarily looking to come together, right? So early in Trump's primary campaign, a lot of leaders on the Christian right supported somebody like Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz instead. And it was the alt-right that was initially very energized by his nativist and racist rhetoric and policy proposals. So, but they did come together because, well, in part, the Christian right is also animated by racial grievance, but also they share this antipathy to the entire liberal democratic project, with not only these norms and institutions that undergird it, but just the idea that everyone in a society is entitled to equal rights and dignity.
I think that this understanding of how he's able to bring that marriage together is one of the most, to me, meaningful and strongest arguments in your book for actually the danger that's posed. Because what does it mean if you're able to strengthen a movement that has such a sense of grievance and such a wide breadth of those who see themselves as members?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's a really important point that you make. I just want to let people know who are just joining. If a friend shared this with you, you have a good friend. We're talking with author Sarah Posner on her new book, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. If you haven't shared this, please take a moment and do so. If you're on Facebook, host a watch party in groups that you're a part of. Make sure that you're retweeting it on Twitter. I'm Sam Goldman. This is Inside Without Now, a live brought to you by Volunteers with Refuse Fascism. Refuse Fascism is a movement organizing for mass sustained protests demanding Trump Pence out now, not stopping until that demand is won. So I wanted to get into a question about some of what they've successfully done, because it's not just ideas. It's not just independent religious ideas that these leaders hold, but things in the real world, the impacts that they have. Some people know that Mike Pence wants to outlaw abortion, hates LGBTQ people. Some know that Pompeo talks about fighting a holy war. Some know that DeVos has a Christian fundamentalist background, but most people don't fully grasp that these aren't privately held beliefs of a few individuals, but that the Christian fundamentalist ideas are a central driving force in power currently. This is something that throughout your book you talk about in terms of the scope of the impacts that they've had, with a special emphasis on HHS. Mm-hmm. What do you see as some of the most far-reaching impacts that the Christian fundamentalists have made since Trump has been in power?
One of the driving ideological forces for the Christian right is the idea that rights for other people, particularly LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights, are necessarily an infringement on Christians who oppose same-sex marriage, or who oppose trans rights, or oppose abortion. So we saw a lot of this activity leading up to Trump's presidency. People probably remember the Hobby Lobby case, the 2014 Supreme Court decision that basically said a privately held company, its religious rights were violated. It has religious rights, and they were violated by having to provide contraception coverage in its employer health care plan. This was a requirement of the Affordable Care Act under Obama, and this caused a huge backlash from the Christian right, saying that forcing Christian employers to provide this coverage caused them to be complicit in a moral sin. And so people might remember the Supreme Court case that was decided just a few weeks ago. This was another of a huge cluster of cases that Christian right activists brought to undermine the contraception coverage requirement in the Affordable Care Act. And so basically now most Christian employers can say, we're not covering that. Or at HHS now, they're trying to bolster the ability of contractors and grantees who get federal taxpayer-funded grants to provide social services or needed social services across the country. Their ability to say, I'm not serving this person, or I'm not providing this service because it interferes with my moral conscience. They developed an entire division within the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services called the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division, which is entirely designed for conservative Christians to file complaints against states, against insurance carriers, against hospitals, claiming that some requirement or some medical procedure or a policy or a law violates their religious conscience. So it's really an embedding of this idea that these rights for other people, your right to get contraception from your healthcare plan, your right as an LGBTQ person to exist, it is necessarily an infringement on Christians' religious rights. And so this has become much more institutionalized in HHS under Trump. But it's not the only agency where these kinds of arguments are being made to advance policy that's detrimental to people outside these conservative Christian beliefs.
I mean, I agree. I think that one of the things that strikes me is also, you write in the book about how the judges that he's put, not just in the Supreme Court, but across the country, and you think about the far-reaching impacts of that, is something that I think is very heavy and is one of the biggest ways that they've been able to accelerate their program.
Right. A very important thing for people to understand about judges is that Trump is nominating very young judges. Federal judges have lifetime appointments. And so when you nominate somebody who's in their 30s to one of the most powerful appellate courts in the country, which is the DC Circuit, they can have an impact on the law. I mean, obviously the Supreme Court has an impact on the law, but appellate judges, and even trial court judges. And so one example is Justin Walker, who Trump nominated to a trial court position in Kentucky. He's a friend of Mitch McConnell's. He clerked for Brett Kavanaugh. And while he was a judge in Kentucky, he heard a case where a church was challenging the stay-at-home orders for the pandemic, saying that it violated the church's religious freedom to not be able to have Easter services because of the stay-at-home orders. And Walker wrote this scathing, off-the-charts opinion where he accused state and local officials of trying to criminalize Christianity on Easter Sunday. And now, I mean, Trump also nominated him to the D.C. Circuit. So now he's on the D.C. Circuit, one of the most powerful appellate courts in the country, if not the most powerful appellate court in the country. And he's in his 30s, and he will be on that court for many, many, many years. So the more judges that Trump, with McConnell's help, can get on the federal bench, the more these kinds of legal ideas will become part of the law.
Yeah, it's the scope and the gravity for so many people. When you think of, these, not to belabor the point, but many, many more people go through these federal courts than the Supreme Court here. In terms of people's everyday life, this is a huge, huge impact, especially for, women, LGBTQ people, people of color. So I think that it's really important to pay attention to those things. I want to let people know that are tuning in. Thanks for joining. This is Inside Without Now. It is a live brought to you by volunteers from Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam, one of those volunteers. Refuse Fascism is a movement to drive out the Trump-Pence regime through sustained mass nonviolent protests. Tonight, we're talking with Sarah Posner on her new book, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. After tonight's live, be sure to visit refusefascism.org to find protests near you, learn more, and donate to support this movement. Again, all donations made tonight will be matched, so give generously. Be sure to follow us at Refuse Fascism. And I want to take a couple questions that people have sent in. I'm going to take one from someone in Chicago. Would be interested to hear how the Christian fascist base is accepting this ridiculous conversion story from Roger Stone. The leaders are so full of BS, but what about the base? How do they see him?
So that's interesting. So, Roger Stone was interviewed by the Christian Broadcasting Network's David Brody, who's the network's Washington correspondent, political correspondent. And the interview, I think, was also rebroadcast or written about on this site called Just the News, which is something that was a news site that was launched by John Solomon, the sort of notorious Hill opinion writer who pressed a lot of the Trump administration's bullshit Ukraine arguments. So they ran this story about Roger Stone finding Jesus, and I haven't seen a lot. And obviously there's not a lot of things happening where I could do any on the ground reporting and talk to people in the base about how they're reacting to this. There have been leaders who, like Ralph Reed, tweeted approvingly about it. There is quite a bit of credence in the base for the idea that the deep state is the conspiracy theory that the deep state is out to get Donald Trump and people close to him. In many of these circles, like Mike Flynn is seen as a victim and a hero, and there seems to be a push to portray Stone in a similar light. But it's been so recent, I haven't seen a lot to get a good feel for whether people are being credulous about this Stone conversion story or not. But I do think that there is a lot of sympathy for the idea that Stone and Flynn and Trump himself have been wrongly targeted by law enforcement. or by, in Trump's case, by Congress.
And if you think about, the belief that many of them hold that God anointed Trump to be the leader, then those who Trump, brings close to him and sees as loyal must by then, be sanctified in a certain way. If their infallible leader is embracing him, then they should too. I think might be part of it, but
I think that's part of it. I think it's also just a kind of herd mentality a little bit about some of these conspiracy theories without even really knowing that much about what Mike Flynn was accused of doing and what he pled guilty to doing. And similarly with Stone. Yeah.
Thanks, Lena, for sending in that question. Another question that's related was about how, I want to read exactly what they wrote. How does Trump's adultery sit with evangelicals?
So obviously a lot of the, all of the evangelicals who supported him knew about the Stormy Daniels and also the Access Hollywood tape. And there were many who supported him, obviously, like before any of that came out, and continued to support him when that came out. According to people that I've talked to, Trump, after the Access Hollywood tape came out, there was a group of evangelical leaders, pastors, who called Trump and prayed with him. And the argument that they make often is that, sure, he's a sinner. We're all sinners. And sometimes God chooses an unlikely leader to carry out his will. And so that's often the excuse that's made for why you, a political movement that has always pressed the idea that politicians should be Christians, that they should exemplify family values and morality. Why is it suddenly okay for you to support somebody who is on tape boasting that he grabs women by the pussy or that he paid off a porn star that he had an extramarital affair with? And again, they say this thing, well, sometimes, we're all sinners and sometimes God chooses an unlikely leader. And in this case, Trump has come at a moment when America is on the brink of, not being a Christian nation anymore, being taken over by, liberal political correctness. And God has chosen Trump to reverse that and give us back the Christian America that God intended. I know that's probably not a very satisfying answer for the person who asked the question, but that is how they talk about it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a different view, a view that kind of denies reality, which isn't satisfying to people who don't take that view. I wanted to go back to your book. In it, you wrote, the Christian right movement was born out of grievances against civil rights gains for Blacks and a backlash against the government's effort to ensure those gains would endure. MAGA to the alt-right is clearly about making America white again, right? Most people are able to...
They're explicit.
Yeah, they're explicit about it. Yeah. They come out in the open. There's no hiding it. They're white supremacists, right? What role, you spoke briefly to this earlier, what role do shared grievances play in that marriage of, the so-called alt-right, the white supremacists, overt white supremacists, and the Christian fascists? And why do you feel, or you think, that white supremacy is a central part of that.
So the Christian right as a movement that came together in the late 1970s, first with the Moral Majority, and then there were other organizations that were formed. The sort of founding myth of this movement is that these evangelicals and fundamentalist Christians were motivated to get involved in electoral politics because of Roe v. Wade, the 1973 decision by the Supreme Court legalizing abortion across the country. But in fact, the history shows something different. Yes, there were conservative Catholics, right-wing Catholics, who at the time were very opposed to abortion, and there were some, evangelicals who opposed abortion too. But at the time, New Right, it was called the New Right, a growing political movement at that time, was trying to organize a coalition of voters that included white evangelical Christians in a coalition to build a new right-wing movement that would be a sort of more radical answer to country club republicanism, or the republicanism of or conservatism of the National Review. So, but they could not get white evangelicals to get excited about the abortion issue. But what they were excited about was efforts by the federal government to ensure that private schools, private K through 12 schools, and colleges and universities were not being run with segregationist or discriminatory policies. So this resulted from a series of court cases where parents in Mississippi challenged these, they were called segregation academies. These were academies in the South, schools in the South, K through 12 schools in the South, that were formed explicitly to have a segregated school after Brown v. Board of Education and school desegregation. And the courts basically said, you can't do that. You can't form a private school to avoid the legal requirements that apply to public schools. You can't have a private school and still get a tax exemption, have a tax exempt private school and have a tax exemption for that, because that's basically subsidized by the American taxpayer. And so evangelicals fought, and fundamentalists fought, a lengthy battle with the IRS, which had developed all of these different policies to ensure that K through 12 schools, including K through 12 Christian schools, which may not have explicitly been formed as segregation academies, but were nonetheless mostly white, were ensuring that they could have a more diverse and not segregated student body. And most famously, the IRS took away the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University, a college in Greenville, South Carolina, that had a policy against interracial dating. And the IRS took away its tax-exempt status on the same grounds. And so this was a huge thing in the evangelical and fundamentalist community, because they believed that the government was infringing on their religious freedom. And so this sort of idea, even though at the time was about race, this idea that the government getting involved to address these civil rights issues being necessarily an infringement of Christian religious freedom, then still hangs over the Christian right. So you saw the same kinds of arguments being made after the Supreme Court legalized marriage equality. They started saying, oh, is the IRS going to come take away our tax exempt status because we oppose marriage equality? I mean, that didn't happen, but that is kind of the same kind of fears and anxieties that they try to generate in the base. So that was the issue that got these white evangelicals and fundamentalists involved in the moral majority, because they were so energized by the idea that the government could interfere, in their view, with the tax-exempt status of private schools over their admissions policies.
Yeah, I mean, I learned so much from that section of your book. I had known that a lot of what propelled this movement was a set of grievances, was a set of wanting to go back in time and make time stand still. A time before there were, basic civil rights, the rights for women, for people of color, definitely for LGBTQ people, and that there was vengeance,
And I wanted to add something that as time went on, the Christian right was very deliberate in portraying itself as not being about race, that they really were, in retrospect, they tried to make it seem like they had always gotten involved because of abortion, even though abortion really was a later issue for them. And they did a lot of work, especially in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, to bring in more diverse leaders and try to build a bigger tent, so it wouldn't seem like that they were just a movement of white people, but that really was like their beginning. And I think that even though they did have some success in bringing in Latino and Black pastors and leaders into the movement, people who were shared their opposition to abortion and LGBTQ rights. The fact that they have stuck with Trump, right? And so like everything that Trump has done is not like, oh, it's not that, oh, well, we'll let that racist comment pass because he's doing all these other things on abortion or religious freedom, or we'll let the child separation policy pass because of all these other things. They actively justified and rationalized these things. They rationalized his child separation policy. They rationalized keeping kids in cages. They
liable to do it.
Yes. And they've rationalized almost everything he's done, and are cheerleading his judges. He's nominated about a dozen judges who would not say in their confirmation hearings whether they thought Brown v. Board of Education was rightly decided. I mean, we're used to them taking that, being so cagey about that on Roe v. Wade, but it was kind of unprecedented for that number of them to refuse to take a position on Brown v. Board of Education.
And a lot of that, those sentiments and the centrality of white supremacy and the nakedness of it, and the way that it was paired with, for no other word, I'm going to say theocratic tones was, very obvious to many people in his Mount Rushmore speech. The whole manifest destiny section, many people were kind of realizing it for the first time, I think, around that speech.
Right. But in the book, I talk about how he energized the alt-right, like pretty much right out of the box, with coming down the escalator and saying that Mexicans were criminals and rapists. He put forth his immigration policy in August of 2015 when he had just launched his primary bid. And they were very excited about that. And there were some evangelical leaders who were getting on board with him at the time, but there wasn't kind of like the mass coalescing around him that happened later. But still, a lot of the evangelicals who opposed him now are either opposed him in 2016, now are either silent or completely on board with him. I mean, look at somebody like Ted Cruz, who, did battle with Trump after Trump insulted his wife and, pinned his father to this crazy conspiracy theory about the JFK assassination. And now he's, one of Trump's number one supporters in the Senate and will back him on virtually anything. So, as he's become more and more overt about his racism, which was, pretty overt, but going back to the beginning of his campaign, there's more into, before his campaign, but there's just been more and more of a coalescing around him and treating it as not a big deal. I mean, in the book, I talk about like a series of events: the shithole countries comment, Charlottesville. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And there wasn't, he received no pushback from his evangelical advisors on those things.
I wanted to shift the conversation to what's going on with coronavirus. Refuse Fascism has a statement of conscience available on refusefascism.org. And in it, in our statement, we argue that the regime bludgeons the very notion of objective truth, trafficking not merely in lies, but in flagrant campaigns of disinformation. They purge those who refuse to march in lockstep, then pack the judiciary, the police, and the military, the executive and legislative branches, and the state houses with fascists and all manner of reactionary zealots, including theocratic Christian fascists, who see this as their last chance to cement their domination for generations to come. And I'm wondering, how do you see this playing out? Do you see this playing out in terms of the attacks on objective truth and the purging in relation to Trump-Pence's COVID-19 response and the influence that Christian fundamentalists have had in shaping that response?
So for a lot of them, they have bought the claim that Trump has handled this perfectly. Like, he's done all the right things, and they will follow his twisting of data to try to say, death rates are down, so that's okay, or his claim that the only reason why we're seeing more cases is we're testing more, or for a long time, obviously, his mask demonizing. And so it's just part of a pattern or the usual course of things as it exists between Trump and his base, where no matter what either incompetent or corrupt thing he does, they find a way to spin it as, like he's actually doing really great, or it's just the fake news is out to get him and they're twisting his words, or claiming, leveling these false claims at him. And then you have the added issue of churches meeting during COVID, and obviously we know now from the scientific and medical research that churches and other places of worship like choir practice and funerals and that sort of thing have become in some instances super spreader events. So it's not like, going to church is just this free of any COVID dangers. Yet there's a raft of lawsuits and very prominent Christian right law firms involved in these lawsuits representing churches and pastors and claiming that stay-at-home orders or restrictions on gathering sizes infringes on their religious freedom. Again, we're back to this issue of the government doing something to protect everybody, and that it's portrayed as violating their religious freedom. And so I think that Trump has tried to walk this line. So they're backing him up despite his completely catastrophic response. And he's trying to walk this line where he is trying to signal to them that, maybe back in April, he said that they should open for Easter, and he still talks about that these are the kinds of things that should open, but there are a lot of public health questions about that. So again, we have this religious freedom issue all wrapped up in this other larger question, which in this case is, the most challenging public health issue to face America in, a century. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of the dynamic that we're seeing between them, where his base backs him and he's still trying to signal to them, and they're trying to promote the idea that restrictions infringe on their religious liberty.
I think that's a really important point about, how how the notion of religious freedom and how that gets weaponized to further this regime's program, and indeed crimes. And I think for a lot of people, including people of faith who don't share this vicious program, it seems so to them unchristian or why would you want to send children to die? Why would you want to kill teachers? How can you justify this? And I think it's it's a reckoning of what that program is about.
And the other kind of amazing thing about all of it is the Christian right has spent decades trying to claim that even the smallest, most remote use of government resources for abortion or even contraception is a violation of their moral conscience. Yet now the government, through its incompetence and deliberate mishandling of the coronavirus crisis, is endangering and has led to the deaths of over 100,000 Americans. And doesn't that violate other people? It violates my conscience, right? So the idea that they have spent so many resources on this abortion question, so the Hobby Lobby has to pay for your insurance coverage for your IUD, or your Plan B, which maybe sometimes, this isn't even true medically, but they claim that sometimes it can cause a miscarriage or abortion. So that is a deep violation of their conscience, right? Like, they spent all this time and resources litigating that, and now we have this going on, and Trump is just, getting a pass, at least from the religious right leadership. I think he's seeing a little bit of erosion in the base in terms of his handling of the virus. But again, we don't know whether, they'll still vote for him in November anyway.
Do you see an erosion of his Christian fascist basis in terms of the response to COVID-19?
So there's been a couple of polls out which show his approval on the coronavirus issue among white evangelicals to be in the 60s. So, which is kind of, his approval with evangelicals since mid 2016 has wavered between the mid 60s and the high 70s, right? But because the culture wars are so embedded in the ideology that drives these voters, they may be disapproving of his handling of the coronavirus, but come November, when they're in the ballot box, they're going to say to themselves, but can I vote for Joe Biden, who Donald Trump has been telling me wants to abolish the police in the suburbs and will bring on abortion on demand and all of their usual talking points. So there was a Pew survey which found his approval among white evangelicals on the coronavirus to be in the 60s, but 82% of them said they would still vote for him in November.
So about the same amount.
About the same, right.
That did vote for him.
Yeah.
I wanted to let people know who are just tuning in, this is Inside Without Now, and we are talking with Sarah Posner, author of Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. Inside Without Now is a live and podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers. Refuse Fascism is a nationwide movement of people coming from diverse perspectives, united in the recognition that the Trump-Pence regime poses a catastrophic danger to all of humanity and the planet itself, and that it must be driven from power through mass, sustained, nonviolent protests. And I'm hoping that after tonight's live, everybody will visit refusefascism.org to find a protest near them, to connect with a chapter, to learn more, and donate to support this movement. All donations today will be matched, so give generously so that more people can be in this movement and raising this demand at this critical time. And if you don't already, you're watching on social media, but if you don't already follow us, be sure to do so. I wanted to ask one more question, and then I'll bring in some more questions from the audience. What does the world look like if the Christian right continues to win?
Well, so the Christian right ideas are increasingly unpopular with the general public, right? Most people in the United States do not agree that abortion should be illegal in all cases. They do not agree that the rights of LGBTQ people should be constrained. They don't agree that people should be able to raise a religious objection to the exercising of the rights of these other people. Yet, because of its political clout under Trump and within the Republican Party, it has been able to consolidate power under Trump in unprecedented ways through his judicial appointments, but also with the free rein that he has given political appointees within agencies. And I'm not just talking about cabinet secretaries, but also lower level political appointees in federal agencies. And so their worldview is that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and that it's God's intention that America be governed by what they call a biblical worldview or a Christian worldview. And so that view is not necessarily the same Christianity that many other American Christians follow, but this idea that there is no separation of church and state, that the state should be a robust force for protecting the rights of these Christians from incursions from the left, or from political correctness, or from secularism. These are all kind of the bogeymen in this culture war. So if Trump were to win re-election, and if Republicans maintained control of the Senate, thus giving them the up or down vote on the judges, but also Senate confirmable political appointees in agencies, they would continue to consolidate that kind of power through these ideological political appointments and judicial nominations.
Thank you for that. I think that, thinking about the implications of what that would mean for women, what the implications of that would mean for LGBTQ people of color. I think, there's such a pace of how many things happen in the course of a week, where a week is a year, and you think of how much they've been able to transform things in only 4 years.
That's in part because of his willingness to dispense with the institutions and norms of a liberal democracy, which is exactly why his base likes him, right? The rule of law, separation of powers, independent judiciary, and so forth. But when you look at, for example, just this week, or in the past week, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo released this report on this commission on unalienable rights that he created at the Department of State, which prioritizes this idea of what he calls God-given rights to religious freedom that take precedence over other rights. Well, this is, maybe not as explicitly as some other people have done, but Pompeo is articulating this very idea of, religious freedom of conservative Christians being under assault by the rights of others.
I wanted to ask some of the audience this question. We have one from Seattle. How does the white evangelical ideology relate to the calls for law and order and unleashing the feds?
So I think by and large, the Christian right sees that as being a necessary pushback on anarchy in the streets, or what they would describe, what Trump and his allies would describe as anarchy in the streets. They're receptive to the idea that protesters, either anti-fascist protesters or pro-democracy protesters, or whatever category the protesters might put themselves in, that these are left-wing people who are anti-American. I mean, this is why Trump was, not the only reason why Trump was talking about it in those terms in that week when there were the protests in Lafayette Square, and Bill Barr had the protesters cleared with tear gas so that Trump could walk across the square and hold up the Bible upside down in front of St. John's Church. It was precisely because he thought that the evangelical base would actually like the idea that he had forcibly cleared the square of anarchists, or however he characterized it, in order to defend their religious freedom. Now, it was largely seen as a flop by everybody else because it was obviously so police state carried out, and also that it was just kind of ridiculous and lame that he went over there and stood with the Bible upside down and didn't say anything. And also that the church itself didn't even want him there. The Episcopal Church didn't want him there. But it wasn't, I don't think it was seen as negatively by his base. I think maybe some saw it as ham-handed, but I don't think it was seen with the same disdain that other people viewed it with.
Yeah, I think that, people of conscience who really looked at that were able to see how it was ominous, how it was a police state measure, what it means that you're unleashing the military on people, I think, and that it wasn't performative. And I think that there's a lot of work to do with people about dispelling this myth that he's performing something. He's doing it, and he believes it. And I think one of the things that your book talks about is the importance of a strong man for the Christian right. And I think, that's what my understanding of what people who were followers that were coming from that perspective likely saw in his actions that night was that strong man that they craved, that he was carrying forward his mission, and not willing to bow down to those who oppose him.
Right. And also just his willingness to take on these dangerous, violent people who were out protesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wanted to take a moment to share with people who are tuning in a special message from actress Jodie Sweetin on why she supports Refuse Fascism, and then we'll be getting back for a couple more questions with Sarah Posner. So I'm going to be sharing a short video with you.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about why I think Refuse Fascism is such an important organization right now. What we are seeing in Portland is just a testing ground for federal troops being sent in against the wishes of state and local governments. Trump even stated in his interview with Chris Wallace last night that he is going to have to see if the election results are rigged or not. And that should scare all of us. What is happening right now is a slow and more rapid descent into fascism. And I am donating to this cause because I am strongly against the Trump-Pence regime. I think that we need to get out there in the streets now. We need to maintain our support. And I'm here to maintain support. So thank you, Refuse Fascism, for what you guys are doing.
And she wrote, "I won't allow a police state or military war on the people. I'm not waiting for an election that may not come and that Trump won't respect. I'm in the streets now, demanding Trump Pence out now. What about you? Join me in giving to Refuse Fascism. Donate.refusefascism.org. We hope that you'll join in making a donation today." So I have one last question, and then a question from an audience member that I think connects well to it. In Unholy, you write, Trump's white evangelical supporters make up an army of partisans decades in the making, and they will not quietly retreat in the face of defeat. Given the role they played rallying to his defense in the face of impeachment, what should we expect of a base that believes themselves to be social warriors called on by God to protect Trump in the event that he loses or in the event there is a contested election?
Well, I think that there would be questioning of the results, particularly if we have vote by mail because of the pandemic. Trump has been laying a lot, and his allies have been laying a lot of groundwork that of conspiracy theories that vote by mail is rigged or subject to voter fraud. So I think just questioning the results and sowing doubt about the results in people's minds, particularly when we know now that we're going to have a situation, if we have vote by mail, that the results will not be in right away. We're not going to have that election night thing where the cable channels have the blue and red map and they just start, plugging in the colors for each state, and we're going to know by midnight or 3 a.m. It's not going to be that way, and we're going to have to wait and for the results to be counted. And that's going to be a period when Trump and his allies are really going to try to raise questions about the results or claim fraud or just sow doubt in people's minds. So there's that. And then I think if Biden were to win and take office, that there would be a lot of time spent trying to delegitimize his presidency, which is dangerous if the Republicans maintain control of the Senate, because then they would have, the ability to hold hearings and subpoena power and so forth. But if you think about the ways in which the Republicans in Congress, many of them with strong ties to the Christian right, tried to delegitimize Barack Obama's presidency, and also Hillary Clinton's candidacy and tenure as Secretary of State. I think we would be looking at a lot of that. Obviously, they would not be able to do it as effectively if if Republicans don't have control of the House or the Senate. However, they would still, I think, use media and social media and that kind of propaganda mechanisms through not just Fox News, but Christian television and so forth to try to undermine these things. So it's very worrisome and very dangerous, because I think, as we saw with the impeachment proceedings, the conspiracy theory runs deep, right? The conspiracy theory that the deep state is out to get Trump and that this was an illegitimate exercise of power by Congress to even impeach him at all.
Do you see the base, the Christian fundamentalist base, supporting him in, let's say, calling off elections or outright rejecting the results?
Yeah, I think it would be, I hope I'm right about this, very difficult for him. He doesn't have the authority to call off the election, but legally speaking. But I do think that, this raising these voter fraud or rigging kinds of questions is definitely something his base is going to engage in with him. Because to them, losing the election would probably be a pretty lethal blow to a lot of their policy ambitions. They would still have the judges that Trump nominated, but if they lost the ability to continue that court stacking and lost the ability to make policy within the administration, things are going to become more difficult for them just because of the public opinion being in opposition to a lot of their core values.
Yeah, I don't see, them going away. I see them having, them not accepting a defeat. and it's been fostered for so many years. They've been unleashed and they've been emboldened to go further and be more aggressive. And I think that, in particular, this marriage of with the overt white supremacists, and their proclivity to violence in the streets, I think, is something that is dangerous, and that the history of the Christian right has not been absent of violence. You think about those who've been moved to
abortion clinic violence,
bomb abortion clinics, or bomb mosques or any other places of worship in the belief that they're doing a godly act. I think that there's a precedent for it. I
think that the Christian right leadership would not condone or activate people to engage in violence on the streets, but I do think that they would engage in a lot of sowing of doubt, raising conspiracy theories, like questioning the results or questioning the process, and which, is obviously dangerous in its own way. But then, of course, there are a lot of people who just get motivated or incited to violence by Trump himself, which is very dangerous too.
Yeah, it's extremely dangerous, and I think that there would be a time where people would say, he can't call off an election, that's not his job, and the conversation would end there. But with Trump, we know that it doesn't matter what his job or what is legal. He changes the norms, rewrites the law to fit him. I'm not saying that it will happen. I'm saying what is in the realm of possible is forever expanding under the Donald Trump's presidency, but not primarily, not in the interest of humanity at all, unless we go out and change that. I think that given the pandemic, especially, there is, if there are, only mail-in ballots, what does that open up in terms of fraud and the rigging of elections? I think is something.
Well, he claimed that was fraud and rigging. Yeah.
But I mean, the GOP is not above rigging elections. Let me be clear. The GOP is not above rigging elections, regardless of the form. And contested results when he was winning, contested results when he wasn't even the candidate. So I think,
let's face it, they, remember Bush v. Gore. They don't really count all the votes. Exactly.
And I think that, one of the things that I think about is the role of the people in that. And how are we seeing our role and our responsibility in this moment, given the danger that we face? What is our responsibility and what do we do? I want to encourage people to check out Sarah's book, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. It's a fascinating read, and really helps you understand the gravity of what we face, and this point of this has been decades in the making, that have led us here, and this is a moment in which they have a great deal of power, and they aren't going to let go of it lightly. And what that may look like, we may disagree on, but the danger is real, and it's important to understand what we face if we want to get out of this mess. I want to thank you, Sarah, so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And everyone else, I want to thank you for joining us. Be sure to share this conversation, continue to share the live, discuss with your friends and family and neighbors what was brought up tonight. Be sure to follow us at Refuse Fascism. Connect with a chapter near you. Find protests and resources at refusefascism.org. While you're there, I want to encourage you to watch the film, The Trump-Pence Regime Must Go. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. A better world is possible. to get a deeper understanding of the roots of this fascist regime in the history of the US and its deeper roots in the system of capitalism and imperialism. It's a film of the talk by Bob Avakian, and I recommend people check it out. It's available at refusefascism.org. To everyone that was tuning in, that enjoyed the discussion, and wants more people to access this conversation, podcasts, and lives similar to this, and most importantly, to mobilize people in the streets to demand Trump Pence Out Now, to end this nightmare. Donate, refusefascism.org. You can click the donate button there. You can also give at donate.refusefascism.org, which is the direct link to the donate page, or give through Venmo, refuse-fascism. On our donate page, you can find other options for how to donate, including PayPal. All donations tonight will be matched, so please give generously. As Trump unleashes his secret police, the question before us all is, what will we do? Will we accept a fascist America? Will we stand aside, hoping that politics as usual will remove a regime that is subverting elections and using the military to crush dissent? Or will we join others in the streets and stay in the streets to demand Trump Pence out now? In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Trump Pence out now. Take care and good night. Refusefascism.org for more information, including information about upcoming protests.